Today, I'm going to tell you all about the Salem Witch Trials. Get ready to be spooked, shocked, and frustrated, all in one story. What do you get when you cross extreme religious beliefs, hallucinogens, and a town where everybody has some weird beef with each other? If you said the Salem Witch Trials, congrats! Gold stars all around. You will not be accused of witchcraft today. The Salem Witch Trials were a series of court proceedings against hundreds of people accused of witchcraft. This happened all the way back in 1692, colonial Massachusetts, which was a super open-minded, loving, and accepting time. Unfortunately, people would die because of this. 20 people were executed after being found guilty. Most of these were done as a public hanging, but some, well, we'll get into that later. What's interesting about this absolutely insane point in time is accusing people of witchcraft, and all this mass hysteria had already come and gone in Europe. That was such a 17th century fad, but the new colonies had no idea. This was all very scary and new to them. And while the idea of coming to America was to escape religious discrimination, they basically just flipped it around and did it on their own people. Puritans were incredibly strict with how their societies were gonna be. Religion and God were very important during this time. Not to say that those things aren't important now, but back then, that was pretty much the only thing you could talk about. That and cross-stitching, chopping firewood. So since it was such a big freaking deal, denying the existence of witchcraft was basically denying the existence of God. Let me explain. Denying witchcraft is denying the existence of demons and spirits, which also denies the existence of angels, meaning the afterlife doesn't exist. And all of that boils down to you not believing in God, which was just not a thing during this time. Oh my goodness, do you know what I just heard? Well, Goody Proctor told me that Goody Corey told her that Goody Nurse doesn't believe in the big man upstairs. The G.O.D. Scandalous. It's the colonial times, which means white dudes are taking things that don't belong to them. Well, the white dudes in these villages got very territorial of their stuff. To these guys, there's nothing but free land up for grabs, but they decide who gets what and how much. And everybody here wants big pieces of the pie. Now, Salem was made up of two sections, Salem Village and Salem Town. And the people in these towns had a lot of issues with one another. If the 13 colonies were competing for who gets to be the first Real Housewives location, it would be Salem, Massachusetts. Do you know what I mean? They were just riled up people who had beef with everybody. Nobody was at peace. Everybody was mad about property lines and whose cow could graze on whose grass. It wasn't particularly a time when people wanted to compromise much. They needed someone to go to when disagreements arose, and who better than the minister? Each town wanted its own minister because, well, people be having some issues. Ministers were crucial in these communities because, the whole religion thing. They were the ones who loved God the most, right? So they should make all the big decisions too, right? The separation of church and state was definitely not a thing at this point. Hence, religion was pretty much the law. The ministers and other elected people, who were all chosen by white men exclusively, of course, worked directly to fix issues in the villages. Now, the ministers were supposed to be the ones who settled disputes with villagers, but Salem was on another breed of drama. Salem Town voted on its first minister, but he only stayed a few years because the townspeople refused to pay his full salary. Then the town voted on another minister who also left after a few years, probably for the same paycheck problems. Tough break, ministers. Well, eventually, this guy Samuel Parris comes along. Now, at first, people were not happy that some were leaning towards Samuel, but at that point, they had been through enough ministers. They needed someone to fill the spot, and they were desperate. So in June of 1689, the villagers agreed to pay the salary he wanted, and Samuel Parris got started right away, being an absolute monster to everyone. Number one, Samuel Parris was an instigator. Number two, this man is the prime example of power drunk. This guy was messy and lived for drama. He's like me when I watch Selling Sunset, except I don't kill anybody. He was the kind of guy who abused his position of power, making an already not great situation 10 times worse. He would single out people who were in good standing with the church and make them beg for forgiveness in front of the congregation. And these were like minor, teeny tiny mistakes. So in February of 1962, 9-year-old Betty Parris and 11-year-old Abigail Williams, aka the daughter and niece of good old Samuel Parris, started having demonic fits. The girls screamed, threw things, and eyewitnesses said the girls contorted their bodies into odd positions. The 2 girls said that they remembered being pricked by pins, and the next thing that they knew, they were acting strangely. Well, shortly after, some other young girls began behaving the same way Betty and Abigail had. This time, 12-year-old Ann Putnam and 17-year-old Elizabeth Hubbard had been afflicted. Now, of course, there was no other explanations to this than the devil himself. And soon after that, the girls started throwing out names left and right. First was Tituba, an enslaved woman from the West Indies. Tituba did not look like the others in town, almost immediately making her a target for accusation. Apparently, she would read books about demonology or foresee the future for the young girls in town. She would entice young girls like Abigail and Betty, making them behave erratically, only to be explained by one thing: the devil. The other 2 women accused, Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne, were essentially charged because they weren't like the other holy women in town. Sarah Good was a woman living in extreme poverty, basically accused of being a rude. Instead of leading children into salvation, she would scold them. The makings of a witch, clearly. Sarah Osborne was a woman who rarely attended church services and had an inheritance from her previous marriage. On top of all that, she got remarried to an indentured servant, which made the people in town furious. She was accused and arrested shortly after. This is where a common theme starts to take form. In fact, most people, 80% of accused during this time, were women. This is because at the time, women were seen as far more capable of falling for the devil than men. The typical suspects were women. Are we surprised? Living outside of the strict guidelines of Puritanism, usually unmarried and living without children. Well, now everyone in town is starting to freak out. I mean, there was witchcraft on the loose. This is a very real and serious issue that needs immediate action. And immediate action was indeed taken. No one was safe. There were no rules. Not when you're fighting with the literal devil. I mean, it was the wild, wild west out there, baby. So since there were no rules, that meant anyone could be accused, including distinguished members of the church. The really messed up part about all of this, if you were accused, your only way of survival was to name someone else. So as I'm sure you can imagine, people started to bring their petty quarrels with their neighbors to the table. In March of 1692, Martha Corey and Rebecca Nurse, 2 women of high standing in the church, expressed their skepticism for all of this witchcraft business. Martha felt like there was no secure way to validate all of these accusations. Well, questioning an accusation was almost as bad as practicing witchcraft. So right away, the 2 ladies were accused. Hell, a 4-year-old girl was accused of witchcraft, so no one was off the table. Everybody and their mom got accused of witchcraft. If you had fingers, you were pointing at them at somebody. And these minister dudes were going after people under the worst possible assumptions ever. For example, a woman named Bridget Bishop was brought before the whole fancy grand jury as she had been accused. Why was she accused? Well, for quite possibly the worst sin I could ever imagine. Her clothing choices. See, people were all up in Bridget Bishop's business, saying that she had no interest in holy Puritan lifestyle. To be honest, I don't blame her. Everybody sounds like a freaking drag and super judgmental. I wouldn't join in on all of that either. Well, Bridget was thrown into the trial, begging and pleading for her life to, let's be honest, a group of people who had already decided her fate. Now, apparently in the Puritan handbook, wearing costumes or black clothing was a big no-no. And Bridget was a fashionista who didn't want to dress like everybody else. But this is 1692 and self-expression wasn't all the rage just yet. So Bridget was dragged into court wearing a coat that had a couple of odd cuts in the fabric. And since these religious folks were looking for any and every excuse to cause mayhem, they took this and ran with it. Despite listening to her pleas, the officials sealed her fate. Bridget Bishop was executed by hanging on June 10, 1692, just a mere 8 days after she was accused. 8 freaking days, people! The devil works fast. Faster than the DMV. They were moving through these witch trials at a rapid speed. You could be accused in the morning and hung in the gallows in the evening. And I guess at some point, the court officials decided to make some rules, just so things didn't get too out of hand moving forward, you know? Don't want to jump to conclusions or anything. They came up with a list of rules to use as a base for the proceedings going forward. First, the accuser would go to the town magistrate to point their fingers. If they deemed the accusation legitimate, the witch was arrested and brought in for intense persecution in front of everybody. This just gave the people the opportunity to use their hatred and beef with their fellow neighbors to their advantage. Now, what better way to get someone's property than accuse them of something they didn't do and hang them in the gallows? For some, they would meet a far worse end. Giles Corey, the husband of Martha Corey, who was also accused, would not let the messed up system win. He refused to enter a plea of guilty or not guilty. Giles knew that the accusations were, but it's not like there was much he could do, right? Well, the magistrates were not messing around when they indicted Giles. They felt insulted by his refusal to enter a plea and wanted to punish him for it. How dare you not plead guilty to something that you didn't do? That's not very God-honoring of you. And his execution was so medieval in its torture, it was called peine forte et dure, which is French for a strong and brutal punishment. This was brought out in the event of a defendant refusing to plead. Giles had large boulders placed on top of his chest, crushing him until he broke and finally pleaded one way or the other. Here's the thing about Giles Corey though. This dude was an 81-year-old farmer from down the way. He lived through some of the most terrible and unimaginable events in history, managing to somehow make it to 81. You think some pesky boulders were gonna stop him? Ain't no chance. For the next 2 days, more and more rocks were piled on top of him, slowly crushing him to death. Now, each time they asked him if he wanted to plead guilty, he simply replied, "More weight," which is quite possibly the most badass thing I've ever heard. After 2 days of his torture, Giles Corey was pronounced dead. He never entered a guilty plea. He wasn't about to let them have that. He wanted to die with his dignity. I love you, Giles. You're an icon. These torture sessions and executions were always in public setting, as fear was one of the most effective ways of keeping people in their place. After their deaths, the accused people were cut down from the trees, stripped of their clothing, and thrown into ditches or shallow unmarked graves. For those excommunicated from the church, they were refused proper burials. Then, in the dead of night, family members would come to gather the bodies to bury them properly. Now, of course, you didn't want to get caught doing this for fear of being the next one in the ditch. Now, I know you might be thinking, how did the girls start having these demonic fits in the first place? And were there any other ways to tell if someone had been afflicted? Don't worry, your pretty little minds, I'll fill you all in on that one right now. Well, in 1976, yeah, we're jumping way ahead for a second, evidence was discovered that kind of flipped the whole situation on its head. And that was a weird fungus that grows on wheat. I'll elaborate. Ingesting fungi, the unsafe ones, is rarely a safe thing to do. I think you and I can both agree on that one. Well, this specific fungus is called ergot. An outbreak of ergot connected to rye bread would have caused hallucinations and strange behavior for the people of the time. Ergot is basically a fungus, and if you ingest it, your body is bound to have an out-of-this-world reaction. Do you see where I'm going with this? Symptoms from ergot poisoning include involuntary body movement, such as twitching or full-on convulsions, weakened immune system, paranoia, hallucinations, and even death. This wasn't the first time in history that a little bit of ergot poisoning got around, okay? All over Europe in the 15th and 16th centuries, also known as plague time, ergot was attaching itself to already vulnerable areas and only helped double the death toll. In areas that didn't have this contaminated fungi-covered bread, getting accused of witchcraft was like a once-in-a-blue moon type occurrence. Yeah, essentially all of this was caused because some little girl ate a moldy piece of bread, freaked out, and got a power trip from accusing mean women in the town. Sounds like every Thanksgiving at my house. We have now reached the point in this episode where I quickly name off some of the weird witch tests they put people through. Number 1, witch cakes. I promise you it's not tasty in the slightest. Cakes made from rye and the accused person's urine were fed to dogs. If the dog reacted weirdly, that meant the accused was a witch. And if they were using the same rye contaminated with fungus, I'm sure that messed with the dogs too. Number 2, swim test. Accused witches were bound and thrown into a large body of water. Now, if they sank to the bottom, they were innocent. If they floated to the top, they were guilty in doing business with evil spirits. Number 3, prayer tests. Accused people were forced to recite prayers and scripture without messing up. If they did, this was proof that they were tainted. However, the consistency of these tests is highly suspicious to me. For example, one man recited the entire Lord's Prayer just before he was hanged, but this was written off as a trick of the devil, and the dude was killed anyway. Between the first witchy episode in 1692 and the final trials in the following year, over 200 people were accused, several died in jail, and 20 were executed. After the trials, people were determined to save their family name and receive something for all of this injustice. In 1702, the courts finally declared the witch trials unlawful. Still, it wasn't until almost 10 years later that the families of the deceased were given compensation. However, Massachusetts didn't formally apologize for the tragic events until 1957. Now the town of Salem uses the witch trials as a great way to push tourism, especially during the fall months because it's spooky. Yeah, and demented as hell. I mean, leave it to Americans to take a tragic historical moment and find ways to make money out of it. Well, if you're curious as to what this tourist trap entails, the town gets all decked out in scary witchy decor, and you can take tours where they cover the entire event from the beginning to the gruesome end. Okay, call me a hypocrite, but that does sound kind of fun. Who doesn't love Halloween, right? And with that, my friends, we have come to the end of our tale. Wasn't that freaking crazy? I mean, to be fair, this is definitely not the weirdest thing we've ever talked about on this show, but it still makes you think. Just a little bit. Guys, thank you so much for watching another episode of Killer Bites. My name is Mack, and we'll catch you guys on the next episode.